Hello everyone and welcome to another loosely scripted supplemental, and today we are once again returning to the well of ranking some random bullshit from the Star Trek franchise. Today we are talking about the second in command, the first officer characters. The basic criteria I'm using for this one is based on two questions. Is the character interesting, and are they good at their job? Now, I know interesting is a little vague, but the use of the word ranges from, does the character have a lot of depth, and or are they used well within the show. Also, as a quick caveat, Michael Burnham is not on this list, mainly because she's functioned more as a science officer slash specialist most of the time, and was only a first officer for a handful of episodes. But to quickly sum up my thoughts, I think she's a great character, but a terrible first officer, and the show made the latter point into a whole story, so it seems the writers agree. For that reason, I don't think there's much else to say about Michael Burnham when it comes to ranking first officers in Star Trek. So with that out of the way, let's get to the bottom of the pile. The worst first officer in Star Trek, in my opinion, is Chakotay from Star Trek Voyager. Now, I don't hate Chakotay, I don't think he's an awful character or anything like that. I just think he's cripplingly boring. He just elicits such little reaction from me that I think that's really like the biggest problem with him as a character. It's pretty common knowledge at this point that Robert Beltran, the actor who played Chakotay, didn't really like being on Star Trek Voyager, to the point that each season he actually kept demanding a higher salary, which he thought was just so, ridiculous a demand that he just expected to get fired, and that was basically his way of getting kicked off the show. But it turns out that the producer just kept meeting his demands, and so he just kept being on the show, and I think that kind of contempt for the show itself really comes through in his performance. I think it's decent. I don't think he's awful by any stretch of the imagination, but he just seems largely disinterested with it a lot of the times. He has a few good moments here and there, but I don't know, there's nothing really to define Chakotay other than him being a sort of decent bloke. And I think it's a shame that the Native American consultant for the show was just a complete fraud, and so that part of Chakotay's personality, or that part of Chakotay's character, was also really, really bland. I think that's a shame as well. And yeah, there's not really much else to say. I just think Chakotay is unfortunately totally bland and uninteresting and wasn't really used in an interesting way in the show, and that's why he's bottom of the pile for me. Next up is Jack Ransom from Star Trek Lower Decks. Now, this is a very thin character. There's not much to him. He's very archetypal and very simple, but he makes up for it with a lot of personality, charisma, and obviously humour. For me, at least, he had some of the funniest moments in Lower Decks, and there is potential to develop him further. I think if we've learned anything from Lower Decks, is that there's actually some surprisingly great character writing in this show, and I think Ransom has the potential to develop even further and become a much richer character, but right now I just think he's thoroughly entertaining. He's also a decent first officer from what we've seen. Again, most of the focus of the Lower Decks is obviously on the Lower Decks characters, but from what we've seen of Ransom as a first officer, he seems pretty competent as a Starfleet officer. And yeah, as I said, although he is pretty two-dimensional, pardon the pun, Ransom is really funny and really interesting to watch, and just, I think, very, very entertaining, which is why he's head and shoulders above Chakotay in my opinion. Next up above Ransom is Will Riker from Star Trek The Next Generation. Now, if you haven't seen Space Doc's excellent video just completely harpooning the character of Will Riker, I'd highly recommend that video. It's awesome. And yeah, I do agree that Riker may have done some very questionable things as first officer, such as his behaviour in Chain of Command and a few other things, and in Darmok especially. But there are plenty of moments where he's quite a capable commander. When he's actually taken command of the Enterprise, such as in The Best of Both Worlds, or in Gambit, or in Unification, he's a really great commander and has a really interesting command style. Although some may say he functioned better as a captain rather than a first officer, and those moments where he's a really great commander is kind of illustrative of why he probably should have moved on from the Enterprise at some point, and yeah, the Space Dog video talks all about that, and I can certainly understand that argument. But in general though, I think he's a more than competent Starfleet officer. And of course, Riker is an incredibly charismatic character. Jonathan Frakes is just inherently likable in everything he does, but he's also fully capable of injecting some grit into his performance when needed. For me, Riker is the kind of middle-of-the-road first officer. Though he is good at his job overall, he has made some mistakes, but his personality and screen presence, they always make you root for him. He's a good heroic character to root for, which is why I think Riker is a really good first officer. Above him, however, we have T'Pol from Star Trek Enterprise. Now, T'Pol was easily one of the best characters in Enterprise, although in the first 2 seasons, that's mostly because most of the rest of the cast are quite bland. But in seasons 3 and 4, the writers really found great stuff to do with her. And something I'll be getting into in my retrospective video on Enterprise is how I just really hate how T'Pol was often treated as basically just a sex object, you know. Every opportunity was taken to get her into her underwear and just be really sexual and stuff. And, you know, that stuff, it really repulses me. And I think it's a real shame that Jolene Blalock had to act that stuff, especially since her performance overall was excellent, really. Her training as a model totally plays into her performance as a Vulcan. That kind of Vulcan posture and that poise and that calm. You know, that's something that I think Blalock absolutely has carried over from a modelling experience, and it's to the benefit of the character. Her screen presence just exudes this calm authority, and it's just a really great Vulcan presence, which is why her arcs in seasons 3 and 4 work so well, because we see this usually unshakable Vulcan officer made really vulnerable in her addiction to chemosite in season 3 and with her relationship to Trip in season 4. And the writers also nail that sort of Spock command style, perfectly logical and prioritizing the mission above all else, even at the expense of some of the crew sometimes, but usually her perspective in terms of why she's doing what she's doing is completely understandable from a cold, logical Vulcan point of view. So I would say that T'Pol was a great character eventually. I always thought she was a good character from the beginning, and she became a great character by the end once the writers actually figured out something interesting to do with her, which is why I think she deserves this spot quite high on the list. Above her, however, is Spock from Star Trek the Original Series and, you know, a bunch of his other appearances. In contrast to T'Pol, Spock was great from the very beginning, and obviously Leonard Nimoy's performance was just terrific. Even in the pilot episodes like The Cage and When No Man Has Gone Before, where Spock is actually a bit more emotional, Nimoy's performance is still really great in those episodes. He's just a great actor in general. His coldly logical command style always generated some really great interpersonal conflict on the Enterprise, such as in the episode The Galileo 7. That's a really fantastic Spock-centric episode. But his struggles with his human side and his fight to control his motions and things, that really added a lot of depth to the character as well, and it allowed Spock to surprise us from time to time, such as in the aforementioned Galileo 7, where he ignites all of the fuel that the shuttle has left to signal the Enterprise, in the very slim hope of signaling the Enterprise. You know, he surprises us in moments like that. I think that depth of Spock's character is used consistently well throughout the entire Star Trek franchise. I can't really think of a time when Spock was used poorly or where he didn't have great material to sink his teeth into. And because of that, I'm not really surprised that the Kelvin timeline brought him back and that Discovery brought him back, because there's simply a lot of material to explore with him. He's a really fantastic character. But the top spot, the best first officer in Star Trek, in my opinion at least, is Kieran Reese from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Kieran Reese basically has all of the strengths of the characters I mentioned so far. Nana Visitor has an extremely charismatic, witty, and sometimes very, very funny screen presence, but at the same time, the character is obviously very tortured and guilt-ridden from the Cardassian occupation. She's not only entertaining to watch, but she has a lot of depth as a character, and being outside Starfleet actually helped her perform her job as the first officer better, in my opinion. She was able to call Sisko on his bullshit sometimes, and offer a perspective other Starfleet officers wouldn't have necessarily thought of. I think it's a great resource to have Kira being there for Sisko. The writers also knew exactly how to use Kieran Reese well. There are so many fantastic Kira-centric episodes. There's Duet from season 1, there's Second Skin, there's her entire twisted relationship with Gul Dukat, aiding Damar's resistance in season 7. I will say probably the weakest thread of Major Kira throughout Deep Space Nine is her romances with Shakar and Vedic Bareil, because those guys are just charisma vacuums, but as soon as she got with Odo, great relationship there. So I think, you know, Major Kira was just awesome throughout Deep Space Nine. She isn't nearly as iconic as the other characters on this list, but in my opinion, she's easily the best first officer character in all of Star Trek. Thank you for watching. If you like these videos, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on my new uploads. If you want to help the channel grow, join my patrons or my YouTube members, where you can see videos early as well as some other exclusive content. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.